Emily had never planned on being in the park that day. She hadn't planned on anything. The world had felt heavy, and she was simply going through the motions, trying to shake off the weight of her thoughts. The Pacific Northwest air was cool, and the ocean's hum in the distance couldn't quite reach her. It was just another dreary afternoon, and she had no expectations. She was simply walking to pass the time, hoping to find some sense of peace she hadn't known in months. As she walked, her thoughts drifted in and out until a soft sound caught her attention. A faint cry, almost too quiet to be real. A kitten. She paused, uncertain if she'd heard it, but then the sound came again, clearer this time, desperate. A soft mewl that tugged at her heartstrings. She turned, looking around. The park was empty, the kind of quiet that made everything feel even more lonely. The cry came again, and this time Emily felt an undeniable pull to follow the sound. Her steps quickened as she moved toward a bench, and beneath it she saw a small, trembling kitten. It was barely noticeable, hidden beneath a tangle of leaves, its green eyes wide with fear and confusion. Emily's heart skipped a beat. She dropped to her knees instinctively, her hands trembling as she cleared the leaves away to reveal the tiny creature. It was so small, barely able to hold its body still as it shivered in the cold. Emily's chest tightened as she reached out and gently scooped the kitten into her arms. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. The kitten's tiny body shivered in her hands, but as she held it close, the trembling slowly faded. The kitten's soft purring filled the still air, and Emily could feel something inside her stir, something that had been dormant for too long. She didn't know why, but as she held this small, fragile creature, a weight seemed to lift from her shoulders. The pain she had been carrying for so long felt a little lighter. The kitten wasn't just a lost soul in need of help. It was a reminder that even in the darkest moments, there was a reason to keep going, a reason to care. Emily stood slowly, still holding the kitten, her arms now wrapped around it protectively. The small creature snuggled against her chest, purring softly. Emily didn't come to the park looking for a sign, but in that moment it felt like the universe had given her exactly what she needed. A lifeline.
As Emily walked home, cradling the kitten close to her chest, her mind raced. She couldn't quite explain what had just happened. One moment, she had been walking through the park, consumed by her own thoughts and the weight of everything she had lost. The next, she was holding this fragile life in her arms, a creature that had been abandoned in the cold and forgotten by the world. The kitten, which she had named Rosie in her mind, seemed to sense her unease. It snuggled closer to her, seeking warmth, comfort, a sense of safety. Its small body pressed against hers as it purred softly. Emily's chest tightened, and she felt something inside her stir, something long buried. The softness of the kitten's purring was like a balm to her soul, soothing a pain she hadn't even realized was there. As she entered her small cottage by the sea, Emily stood at the door for a moment, staring down at Rosie in her arms. The air smelled of salt and pine, a reminder of the ocean's relentless rhythm. It was a quiet place, one Emily had come to love and hate in equal measure. It was here that she had suffered her deepest losses, and it was here that she had tried to rebuild, to heal. But the walls of the cottage always felt like they were closing in, and the silence that filled the space was never kind. But now, holding this little kitten, everything felt different. Rosie's soft purring, the warmth of her tiny body, felt like a presence in the room, a living reminder that maybe, just maybe, there was something worth fighting for, something to love, something that needed her, just as much as she needed it. As Emily placed Rosie gently in a soft blanket by the window, she found herself watching the kitten closely. Rosie stretched, yawned, and then curled up into a little ball, her small paws tucked beneath her. Emily's heart ached in a way it hadn't in so long. She wasn't sure what it was about Rosie that made her feel this way, this strange pull in her chest, this sense of responsibility. Maybe it was because the kitten had been alone, abandoned, just like Emily had once felt. Or maybe it was simply because Rosie, despite all the fear she must have carried, had found her. It was as if fate had brought them together, two lost souls who had never expected to find each other. And in that moment, Emily realized something. She had been waiting for a sign, a reason to move forward, a way to push past the emptiness that had consumed her. But she hadn't needed a grand gesture. She had needed something small, something pure, something that would love her unconditionally. As the kitten slept, Emily sat down beside her, letting the quiet wash over her. The room was still, but it no longer felt cold or empty. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long while, she didn't feel alone. Rosie had given her a reason to care again, a reason to heal. And as Emily watched the kitten's chest rise and fall, she knew that in this small, fragile creature, she had found something worth fighting for, something worth loving. The next few days were a blur for Emily. Life seemed to slow down, and yet everything had shifted. Her mornings began with Rosie, the kitten now a constant companion in the small cottage. The once silent home was now filled with the sounds of tiny paws pattering across the floor, the soft jingling of a bell around Rosie's neck, and the soothing purrs that seemed to calm Emily's restless mind. For the first time in a long time, Emily found herself smiling, really smiling in the morning. She'd wake up to find Rosie curled up at her feet or perched on the windowsill, watching the ocean waves crash against the rocks. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Rosie's presence in the cottage had become the pulse of Emily's life, a constant beat in a world that had felt off-kilter for too long. But it wasn't just Rosie's companionship that made the difference. It was the way the kitten needed her. The way it depended on her. For the first time in ages, Emily felt like she had a purpose. Every day, Rosie would nudge her hand for attention, meow for food, or simply curl up in her lap as if she had always belonged there. It was a feeling Emily hadn't realized she was missing, the feeling of being needed. Not just wanted, but needed. In a way, Rosie had saved her as much as Emily had saved Rosie. The kitten, once abandoned and lost, now had a home. And in this small, fragile creature, Emily found herself learning how to care again. To love again. One evening, as Emily sat on the porch with a cup of tea, watching the fading sun dip below the horizon, she realized just how much Rosie had changed her. Her thoughts, once dark and heavy, now seemed lighter. The pain that had been her constant companion was still there, buried deep inside, but it no longer felt as overwhelming. The sadness, the isolation, the loss. They were still part of her, but they weren't all she was. She was a person who could care for something again. Someone who could give love, even if she hadn't been able to receive it in a long time. As the soft evening breeze brushed across her face, Emily looked down at Rosie, who was curled up at her feet. The kitten's eyes were closed in peaceful sleep, and for a brief moment, Emily felt like everything was as it should be. In this quiet corner of the world, with the ocean and the trees as her only company, Emily had found something that was hers to protect, to nurture, to love. She didn't have all the answers. She didn't know what the future held. But she didn't need to know. In that moment, with Rosie by her side, Emily understood that sometimes healing came in small, quiet moments. Sometimes it came with the sound of a kitten's purr or the soft warmth of a body nestled against yours. And that was enough. Weeks passed, and Emily's life began to feel more like something she could hold on to. The pain, though never fully gone, had faded into something quieter, something she could manage. Rosie, now fully part of her world, was no longer just a kitten. She had become Emily's anchor. Every morning, the soft mewing and gentle purring greeted Emily like a promise that today would be different. Today, they would face the world together. One afternoon, as Emily sat in her living room reading a book, she noticed that Rosie had been acting strangely. The little kitten, who had always been so playful and full of energy, was now unusually still. She hadn't run to Emily's side when she walked in, hadn't climbed up onto the couch to nudge her hand for attention. Instead, she was lying in a quiet corner, staring out the window with wide, unblinking eyes. Emily's heart skipped a beat. "Rosie?" Emily called softly, her voice edged with concern. The kitten didn't respond. She stood up, her footsteps quickening as she approached Rosie. The kitten's small body seemed fragile as Emily gently scooped her into her arms. The warmth that had always radiated from Rosie now felt distant, her little body limp in Emily's hands. Panic surged in Emily's chest. "What's wrong, sweet girl?" Emily murmured, her voice trembling. She was terrified. This kitten had been her lifeline, her companion through the hardest time of her life. The thought of losing her was unbearable. Emily rushed to the nearest vet, her mind spinning. Rosie was still so small, so delicate. She had no idea what was happening, but the thought of losing the one thing that had brought her back from the edge was almost too much to bear. The vet's office was a blur of cold lights and sterile smells, the distant sound of other animals in the background. Emily paced the waiting room, her heart pounding in her chest, her mind running through every worst-case scenario. Rosie was her everything now, the small creature who had given her the strength to keep going. She couldn't lose her. Not now. Not when they had just started to heal together. Finally, the door opened, and the vet stepped out with a solemn expression. Emily's breath hitched in her throat, and she rushed forward, nearly stumbling over her feet. The vet's face softened as he looked at her, but the words that came next made her stomach drop. "It's okay," he said, his voice gentle. "Rosie is just a little under the weather. It looks like she's been exposed to some bacteria, but with some antibiotics, she should be back to her playful self in no time." Emily felt her whole body sag with relief, the tension leaving her shoulders as she exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Rosie wasn't going anywhere. She wasn't going to lose her. After a few days of medicine and plenty of rest, Rosie began to regain her strength. The playful, mischievous kitten was back, pawing at Emily's feet, chasing after a ball of yarn, and curling up in her lap every chance she got. The bond between them, already unbreakable, only grew stronger. As Emily watched Rosie bounce around the house, her heart swelled. She had never realized just how much this little creature had come to mean to her. Rosie had taught her to care again, to open her heart, to be vulnerable. And in return, Emily promised herself that she would always protect Rosie, the tiny kitten who had saved her from herself. Emily had been broken, lost, and adrift in a world that felt like it was too much to bear. But now, with Rosie by her side, she was learning to heal, learning to love, and most importantly, learning that no matter how dark things seemed, there was always light to be found in the most unexpected places. Rosie wasn't just a kitten, she was Emily's lifeline, and Emily would never take that for granted again. As the days turned into months, Emily's connection with Rosie grew deeper. It wasn't just about the companionship anymore. It was about something more profound, something that filled the empty spaces in her heart that she hadn't known existed. Rosie had become Emily's reason to smile, to keep going, to face the day, no matter how difficult it seemed. But life, as it always does, had a way of throwing curveballs. Emily's days were still full of quiet solitude, though not as heavy as before. The small town where she lived, nestled along the Pacific Northwest coast, was a peaceful place, but it also carried its own set of challenges. The isolation sometimes pressed in on her, and despite the love she shared with Rosie, Emily often found herself wondering if there was more to life than this. Was she meant to do more than just exist in this quiet corner of the world? One evening, Emily was sitting by the fire with Rosie curled up on her lap, the flickering flames casting soft shadows on the walls. Her thoughts wandered, as they often did, to the future. She had always been a teacher. Her students, her job, had been her entire life. But since moving to this cottage by the sea, she had begun to question her purpose. Was she meant to stay here forever, surrounded by the quiet of the ocean and the trees? Or was there something else out there for her? Something bigger. Rosie's purring broke through Emily's reverie. She looked down at the little kitten, now growing into a sleek, confident cat. Rosie, too, had changed. She was no longer the fragile, abandoned kitten she had once been. She was strong, independent, and full of life. Everything Emily had once dreamed of being, but never quite felt. In that moment, Emily realized something. Rosie wasn't just her lifeline. Rosie had also shown her what was possible. The kitten had taught her to live again, to embrace the small joys, to find beauty in the simple things. But Rosie's resilience, her courage in the face of everything she'd been through, reminded Emily that she, too, had the strength to change. The world around her might be quiet, but it was also full of possibilities. She didn't have to stay in this little cottage forever if it no longer felt right. The love and healing she had found here were just the beginning. She could take this strength, this new understanding of herself, and bring it into the world. She could give love to others. She could do more than she had ever imagined. With Rosie by her side, Emily wasn't just surviving anymore. She was living. She had rediscovered her strength, and while she still didn't have all the answers, she knew one thing for sure. Whatever the future held, she and Rosie would face it together. They were no longer two lost souls wandering in the dark. They were a team, bound by something unbreakable. The next morning, Emily stood by the window, watching the sunrise as it bathed the cottage in soft light. Rosie was at her side, her tail flicking as she watched the world outside. For the first time in a long time, Emily felt ready for whatever came next. She wasn't afraid of the unknown anymore. She wasn't afraid of change. And, as the sunlight filtered through the trees, Emily made a promise to herself. She would not let fear control her. She would live, really live, with Rosie by her side every step of the way. Together, they would embrace whatever the future held, no matter how big or small, because they had each other. And that, Emily realized, was all she needed.